Okay. I don't want to disconcert people with my. Yeah, well, it's people should have a chance to ask questions, but I think this is a good time to sort of take an assessment of where we are and how we got here. It's 2013. You know, and in many ways, what I'm going to focus on up to the present is the 20th century. Because the 20th century as a whole, though most people don't look at it that way, was a disaster. It was you could say, we talk often about a dark age. It was the beginning of a dark age. And we're about to make a decision as to whether we're going to reverse this, what Dave is referring to as a new paradigm. And I'll tell you, in many ways, the new paradigm is not, I would say it rests on 2 points. One is that human beings are not animals. I don't mean human beings are complicated animals, or they're animals with an attitude or something like that, okay? I mean that they're not animals. In strict ontological terms, the nature of our existence is different than an animal. I mean, this is what goes to the essence of environmentalism, which is huge up here in the Northwest. It's been huge up here since forever. It may have something to do with immigration patterns and so on and so forth. Also, the nature of the Northwest is a sort of lovely natural setting and so on and so forth. Though, the weather sometimes leaves something to be desired, but it depends on what you like, But it's a beautiful setting, and there's been a historical migration of people to this area of the United States. In effect, looking away from civilization. We saw this in the 1960s, actually, in a very specific way, because when you got to the end of the so-called, we put it in quotation marks, student movement, the anti-war, which really wasn't an anti-war movement. It was a manipulated social movement. It was a counterculture. Remember if some of you may remember, some of you, that's the calling card of the so-called upheaval of the 1960s. It had elements of it that go back to the civil rights movement, but that was not the student movement. The student movement was a counterculture movement. What culture was it against? And to a certain degree, had it been against the truly dominant culture, it might have been useful. But it was against the culture of the American system, of Franklin Roosevelt, of John F. Kennedy, or at least against their disappointments at these things. It was an upheaval against anybody over 30. It was an upheaval that was manipulated into a drug culture. And of course, an environmental culture. What was the environmental culture? This is the culture of the World Wildlife Fund. What's the outlook of the, first of all, who runs the World Wildlife Fund? 1961, Prince Bernhard, Prince Philip. One of the great representatives of it today is this guy, Sir David Attenborough. I think he's the brother of the actor, but that's not so relevant, okay? And what's his message? He's done massive movies, television, 5-part, hour-long, sections. And what's his theme? The Earth has too many people. Too many people. Ethiopia, what's the problem with Ethiopia? Too many people. Not colonialism, not free trade, not a control by a financial oligarchy. The problem with Ethiopia is too many people. And so, as Dave referenced, what did the Queen say with the failure of the Copenhagen global warming argument? Now we have global, climate change. But what was her answer? She wants to reduce the population from 7 billion to 1 billion, or 2 billion, or 500 million. Some of her allies, there's a guy in Germany, Schellnhuber, who worked on this. He wants, I think, 1 billion. Then you have this guy from the United States, Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the population bomb back in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. 500 million. Now, how do you see people say, well, maybe that's this number, that number, maybe that's a better number we have. But how do you get from 7 billion to 1 billion? Or 2 billion? Or as one guy said, who was a good personal friend of Bill Gates, I forget his name, he runs the second biggest hedge fund in the world. A personal friend of Gates, he said, well, maybe 4 billion. So how do you get from 7 billion to 4 billion or 2 billion or 1 billion? Why do you want to do that? I'll tell you something very funny, just as a sidelight. Why do you want to do that? Because people consume. People are bad for nature. Well, my answer to that is always, then blame it on nature. Because as far as I know, we came from nature. We're in the universe, not some alien force in the universe. If the universe made a mistake, put the blame where it belongs. Now, fundamentally, the universe did not make a mistake, which is the relevant point. Human beings, and I won't get through all of this, but when I say a paradigm shift, human beings represent a capability, a potential, through discovery, through scientific discovery of principle, to change not only their relationship to the universe, but in a fundamental sense, we change the universe. Something happens in the universe that were it not for willful, volitional creativity. That is what we sometimes call free will, but it has to be understood the right way. Because free will is not the ability to, burp in your neighbor's face. Or, a lot of modern art, innovation, is like, you see what happens if you throw paint at the wall. I know some of you may remember the infamous or famous, depending on how you look at it, Jackson Pollock. And he really, he did that. That was some of his paintings. The other thing I remember watching him do was he took a paint tube and held it over and dribbled it off to his back, to a canvas on the floor. And God knows how much he got for it. I'm reminded when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, so at the Baltimore Zoo, which wasn't the most famous zoo in the world, they had a couple of chimpanzees, and I'm not kidding, this is not a joke, okay, who finger painted. In other words, they would, I don't know if you call them fingers, but they would take their forearm, front hand, and they would give them a can of paint, and they would mess around in it, and they would smear something on a canvas. And they sold them. Not to other chimpanzees. So, it's predicated, we're predicated on a scientific demonstration that human beings have a quality that's unique in the universe, or if there are other creatures like us, they have that quality. They're different than an animal. Who knows what's out there? I mean, this isn't science fiction, but there are some interesting things in the universe that says maybe someday, way into the future, we'll find some other creatures with the same creative capability. We change our relationship to the universe. Things that we do wouldn't happen. And we're actually at the very early stages of this. Because in order for the human species to survive, we're going to have to go into nearby space minimally. Some of this, by the way, we've just really begun to reprint, in print form though it's online, the 21st Century, which is a science magazine that's been out of print and now back in print. And the inaugural issue is on the strategic defense of the Earth, which I will, and it goes through some interviews with people working on that question. And the issue is, are we going to be vulnerable to changes in the solar system, which threaten the existence of the species? For example, most people now, even the lunatics, admit that the biggest factor in the weather on the Earth is the sun. Big discovery. you would think that the largest source of warmth and light and so forth that governs the planet might have something to do with weather. Okay? And so we have to know what's the status of the sun. What's the effect on the overall solar system? What's the effect on the human species into the future? You know, some people, blanch at the idea, the sun, given the type of star it is, it probably has a couple, I don't know, some billions of years before it goes through its death throes. But, number one, if we want the human species to be around for as long as it can be around, essentially an immortal species, then we're going to have to start making discoveries now to control or to take us to parts of the universe that are unaffected by this. But I would also say that if the sun has a life cycle, then we don't know exactly what is going to go on in the life cycle 1,000 years from now, 500 years from now, 10,000 years from now. It may or may not make this place habitable. So we have to find out about these things. And it's a good way to stretch the mind. We're not here simply to exist for our allotted time on the planet. We're not limited to the planet. We can't judge the universe sitting on this planet. There's too much going on that is not affected or controlled by the Earth. The Earth is more part of the process of the development of galaxies, solar systems, and so on and so forth. You know, it is a shocking thing. There's now I don't want to just use facts, but you know, for a long time, the idea was that, you know, that we have life on the planet Earth because we're just fortunate in this great statistical random grab bag of the universe, otherwise moving into random disorder and so forth, but we happen to land in what they call the Goldilocks zone. You know, we are just far enough from the sun is just the right size, we're not too close, we're not too far, and et cetera, et cetera. And the odds on this happening are very, very high. You know, a Googleplex to 1, you know. Well, actually, we're finding some interesting things out. Because we now have the Kepler orbiter and other means of looking at galaxies, this galaxy and galaxies beyond. And what we found is, you know, evidence, I would say at this point, indications that many, many, many stars have solar systems, have systems of planets. Now, many of them obviously are too close to the star, too far from the star, and all this business. But we're now finding a large number of planets, or we think, I mean, this is all, we have to, this is the reason to figure out what's going on. A large number of planets that exist in roughly Earth zone, somewhere between, you know, half the distance to 1.5 an Earth distance from their respective star. And there are indications that these planets are roughly Earth-sized. And again, it could be half the size to maybe 1.5 or 2 times the size. Now here's the shocker. Based on the density of these Earth-sized, Earth-orbital planets that there's evidence of, one estimate is that there might be 17 billion of them. Not 1 or 2 or 3, or 10 or 100, but 17 billion. Now that does change our perspective on what the universe might look like.